For this video, we want to talk about the 5 strategies. And these 5 strategies guarantee to increase not only critical thinking and retention and completion, but have a deeper and more meaningful learning. And we'll talk about this as we go through the introduction. We could very well title this section, How to Have Better Students in Your Classes, because that's exactly what will be created with these strategies. Using high-impact strategies allow us to provide a high-quality education to all students, not just those who are willing or able to compensate for ineffective strategies. So this approach absolutely is much more about mindset than skill set. It doesn't require as much of a skill to implement these as it does the courage to get out of our comfort zone. But the mindset we approach, and that mindset must be that, of course, all students can learn, and given the right environmental conditions, we can make that environment more conducive to critical thinking, to deeper learning. So what we want to start with is we want you to keep in mind, I will set the mindset with this quote, that student success is fostered by providing a student-centered environment and support services that respect and value diversity. Because the only way to get a diversity in enrollment is to have a diversity in completion. And we have a diversity in completion by using a diversity of instructional strategies. So what we want you to do right now, take 5 minutes and write a possible response to each of the problems below. Now, what you write may not completely solve the problem, but it should help improve the issue. Something you would do, not what student services is going to do, what somebody else is going to do, your class, your subject matter, your students, what will you do to help improve these areas? Take 5 minutes, pause the video right here, and then pick back up afterwards. So the first discussion will be the difference, talking about the difference between equality versus equity. Now you can notice from the first picture there in the first image that everyone can't see the ball game. There are certain barriers that are put, and that's the wooden fence, the wood that are put up there, the barriers. And sometimes students have socioeconomic barriers. They have all kind of barriers in their life that may preclude them from reaching the level they need to reach, or in this case, seeing the ball game. Even though, if you'll notice, each of those have one box to stand on. So as a teacher, we could say, well, I provided equal opportunity for all these by providing them equal number of boxes. However, you can see that that does not lead to an equity in opportunity. We did give them equal number of boxes, but that did not lead to equity. In the second image, you'll notice we've redistributed those boxes. The first child didn't need a box. They could see over the fence fine. The other one only needed 1 box, and the other one needed 2 boxes. But by providing these boxes, and for us, that'll be providing high-impact proven strategies in the classroom, instructional strategies and support strategies. By providing that, we now have an equity in terms of opportunity. Opportunity in this case to see the ball game. Now the third image says what could happen if we remove those barriers. And those systematic barriers are much more difficult to remove for the classroom instructor. That would have to do with home life and the core culture of origin or socioeconomic barriers. So we approach it through an equity, not necessarily a quality standpoint. Because every decision we make ought to be guided by 2 key questions. And we'll keep in mind throughout our presentation, we'll continuously talk about how great teachers ask great questions. Great teachers are great leaders because great teachers lead. They're able to get students to do what they need to do, but may not want to do. But by the same token, great leaders are great teachers. In order to lead, they have to teach. So great leaders, great teachers go hand in hand. They ask great questions. And what we'll throw onto that is, you're not the answer key. Let them flounder. Let them come up with their misconceptions. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But we're guided by 2 key questions. Number 1, whatever we're doing, will this improve and expand student learning? And keep in mind, this ties directly to the mission of the community college, or for the faculty member. That mission is to inspire and facilitate learning with a diverse group of students. Now, I say with the faculty member, that would be the same mission for any staff member also. Anybody at your college, their overall purpose is to inspire and facilitate learning. And then the second question would be, how do we know it improves and expands learning? And of course, that would be follow the data. Anything we implement in the classroom, we start with baseline data. If we're implementing something in the fall, I would look back at the past fall's average test scores. And I would compare that with once I implemented this new strategy. So the data itself would let us know if it improved and expanded learning. Because we're coming from an archaic system where it was teacher-centered. It was a sage on the stage. We were an hour and 15 minutes of straight lecture. And then we realized we have to incorporate the learner in this. This passive learning that's going on in the classroom is not leading to meaningful and longer term learning. So we focused on the learner. But what we forgot in that process, we left our own selves out as instructors. So that's why we call it learning centered. And learning means both the student and the faculty are doing the learning. Because when the teacher quits learning, the students quit learning. And we can carry that over to other aspects of the classroom. When the teacher quits becoming motivated, the students quit becoming motivated. When the teacher loses hope, the students lose hope. And that's why we don't use words like common sense anymore. You know, if we were looking at a school bus and we simply ask you the question, is it moving left or right? Forward, is it moving left or right? And keep in mind, 80% of 10-year-olds can answer this question almost immediately. Because to those 10-year-olds, they know that the door on that school bus is on the opposite side on the left end. So therefore the school bus has to be moving to the left. Of course, it makes sense after we point that out, but it may not make sense before. So when we say common sense, you know, quite frankly, that's not a flower that grows in everyone's garden. But more importantly, common sense from whose culture? You know, different cultures of origin. We're a very pluralistic society. We can't assume that's what's common sense in our culture is common sense across all cultures. Now, in implementing multiple strategies at once, what we're looking for is research that shows us what the impact that can have on students. This particular study was California State University. They were comparing their very high minority group, which were Latinos, to the success and completion of non-Latinos. Now, what you'll notice in here is that with no high-impact strategies, the non-Latinos had a 45% greater chance of completion. They implemented just one high-impact strategy, and that gap was closed to 29%. With two high-impact strategies, it was closed to just 5%. And you'll notice by the time they reached the third high-impact strategy, not only was the gap completely closed, but the non-Latinos graduation the Latinos graduation rate had exceeded the non-Latinos. And this has been proven all across the country. All student achievement gaps have been closed with effective instructional strategies. And that's because we know we're not dealing with students who are incapable of learning. They may very well have a limited toolkit available to them. You look in a certain student's toolbox, you may only see a screwdriver, which would be a big problem if today's task in the classroom was nailing up a plywood wall. So with only a screwdriver, that student may very well look unproductive, unmotivated, frustrated, overwhelmed. But hand them a hammer and watch their world change. Better yet, hand them a nail gun. There's always another level. And these hammers, these nail guns, what we're doing is we're providing extra strategies for their toolkit. And this is seen for Sandra McGuire, who's a chemistry professor at LSU and also an author on metacognition, reflecting on our own learning. And she talks about how just having a session discussing with students the power of the brain and how it works like other muscles, the fact that the more you use it, the stronger it gets. And through some study strategies, significant increases in test scores, especially for your first-generation college students. She looked at her fall data and said that their data was showing there was a problem in her class. And you can see the exorbitant rate of failures there, especially for African American and Latino. Now, once they implemented these metacognition strategies, you can see how that leveled the playing field in the fall 2011 graph across the board. And that's the power of these strategies. That's exactly what they do. They provide a more equitable environment where there's truly an equal opportunity to succeed. You can see the test scores for these students, whether it's science, psychology, chemistry, how low they started out until they had a session on this metacognition, started reflecting on their own learning and their own study strategies. And you can see the significant improvements on those. So these metacognition exercises, one would be to, if you had all students earned an A on exam one, have them write the learning strategies that they used that would help them, that helped them do well on the test. That would be an example of reflecting back on one's studies to see, okay, what did I do to help me be successful? And by the same token, those students that did not do very well, give reasons they think that happened. Give a reasons why they think they didn't achieve the score they wanted. Once again, it's forcing them to reflect back on them and what they did for this process. Fink, a well-known author that's quoted many times, it talks about learning experiences, that although faculty members want their students to achieve higher level learning, many times they don't use a form of teaching that naturally promotes such learning. And he goes on to say that how the lectures are so much less effective in retaining information, solving problems, critical thinking, transferring knowledge from one course to another situation, very crucial for deeper learning and more meaningful learning. And then it says it often diminishes the student's motivation to continue learning, because lectures do not naturally support the building of soft life skills. An active learning environment naturally promotes these soft life skills: communication, conflict resolution, quantitative reasoning, critical thinking, problem solving. Matter of fact, there was a recent article on a robot that passed the University of Tokyo's entrance exam without any understanding of the material, just rote memorization and regurgitation. So this gives an example of how sometime in today's society we still focus on that rote memorization for regurgitation, which is not very rigorous in terms of neuronal activity and using the brain to actually learn, but we'll get more into that in a minute. So as we go through 5 strategies, we want to keep in mind the 3 basic principles of instruction. These 5 strategies are specifically to enhance these 3 areas. And the first one's maximum engagement. One way to do that is through frequent assessments we'll talk about. But the whole point of instruction to maximize the engagement and to do that with relevant instruction. Now, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. If the instruction's relevant, it will be interesting, and if it's interesting, students will be more engaged. So these go hand in hand. That relevancy has to do with the why. Do we explain to students why we do a certain exercise, why we carry a class on a certain way, and do things in a certain order? And then our third, and probably the most important, supportive relationships. Those early intrusive interventions, that constant encouragement that students need, or that anyone needs for that matter. Because anytime we're approaching a skill or behavior for the first time, we're learning a skill for the first time, then for that skill, we're in kindergarten. We're starting at the lowest level, and then we'll work our way up. And so those supportive relationships are so important. It reminds us of the informational research that shows a connection with just 3 folks on campus doubles the rate of completion. So when we're looking at the learning pyramid, and these, by the way, this average student retention rate is retained material, and lecture is the least effective at retaining material. So what we'd want to do is we'd want to minimize straight lecture, even though, of course, there's a place for lecture. But we want to minimize that, and we want to maximize those things that lead to a deeper, more meaningful learning, or true learning. So when more we incorporate the student in the process, very simple analogy. The one that does the work does the learning. The one that's doing the talking is doing the learning. So the more we incorporate students in an active learning environment. And then this quote, I actually couldn't believe it when I first read it. I couldn't believe it was true. And you can read that to yourself. If students withdraw or fail from even one of their first 5 courses, their chance of graduating is cut in half. Failure from a second one, cut in half again. So it called the IT department at the institution I was working and said, we run this data for our college. I just can't believe this is right. And when the data came back, it was more than half for the first failure or withdrawal. It was cut in half, or it was cut 58% less chance of completing. And then the second withdrawal was cut in half again, just like these statistics show. And by the third and fourth withdrawal, there were about 3 students out of over 300 that actually completed. So we see the importance of, number 1, these high impact strategies, but number 2, implement these high impact strategies early on in the student's educational career, those gateway courses, first term, first year courses. Even in Alabama.com, they started rating high schools, giving a grade. And like the article said, regardless of what you think about the grades, they're actually starting conversations which would probably have never been had otherwise. And that's the whole point. Starting conversations, getting that change. You have one school making a 79 across town, another school an 80. Well, you know the first thing you're going to hear is why we get labeled a C, they get labeled a B. There's only 1 point difference. And I'm thinking, okay, it's a good thing these conversations are being had because we've been using the same grading scale on students for decades and never once questioned that aspect of it. So and it's very similar when we first getting into data. We first getting into data, our feelings start surfacing. We get very defensive until we realize that the mission we have of changing lives through higher education, once we realize the importance of that and how that's much more important than any of our feelings. And it was the same way these schools responded about the other things they did that were so important. They said that they thought that the grading or that methodology for grading schools overlooked a lot of things they were doing well. And once again, great conversation. Conversation we should also be having with students. A student that shows up every day, turns in every assignment on time, increases their communication, increases their critical thinking. But yet sometimes their entire grade comes from 2 multiple choice tests. So these are conversations that need to be had. So if we look at the brain, we realize the brain is designed to do several things. It evolved over millions of years to do one thing very, very well, and that's learn. So the learning is important. It wants to learn because it wants to control. The more it can control, the more it feels in control, the less stress. And of course, seek pleasure and avoid fear. So it does that by understanding the environment. The more it understands the environment, the more it can control actions, avoid the danger, search for pleasure. But we got to know that that fear may block understanding. You can't separate the cognitive part of the brain from the affective domain part of the brain. The emotions and the cognitive are extensively overlapped. So any fear may block that understanding. But if we realize that that learning is a natural process, you can't force the brain to learn. It decides to learn on its own. But the thing about students, they're always motivated to learn things that fit what they want. That's why when we say, the more relevant instruction. Because not only do they motivate to learn things they fit, they resist things that don't fit. And that's where a lot of the problems in higher education exist in classes, is it's not relevant to the student. So those emotions, the reasoning, the memory are all so linked in the brain, we have to take into account all those things in a holistic teaching environment. That relevancy, which is so important to engagement, because the relevancy is what increases the interest of the student and make them more motivated to learn. So if your question is, I don't feel like my students are motivated, then the first thing you need to look at is the relevancy.